Good evening, friends. Welcome back to another gentle journey through time. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly, softly, into the world of resilience, survival, and quiet strength, a world where winter was not an enemy to be feared, but a season to be understood, respected, and lived within. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin, I have two small questions for you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? I always find it comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across different places, different time zones, all finding a moment of peace together in the gentle glow of history. Now, let me invite you to settle in. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Rest your head gently on your pillow. Feel the weight of your body sinking softly into your bed. Allow your breathing to soften, to slow, to find its own natural rhythm. Let your shoulders drop. Release any tension you've been holding. You're safe here. You're warm. You're exactly where you need to be. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind tonight, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. No pressure, just an invitation to join us again whenever you need a little calm. Tonight, we'll explore something truly remarkable. We'll walk through the snow-dusted forests and across frozen plains. We'll sit beside fires that have burned for generations. We'll learn how people not only survived the harshest winters imaginable, but thrived within them, building lives of meaning, beauty, and profound wisdom. So breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and let's begin. Let me take you back to a time before weather apps, before heated homes, before grocery stores lined with winter supplies. Imagine a world where the first frost wasn't just a signal to grab a warmer coat, but a call to action that determined whether your family, your community, your entire people would see another spring. The first frost usually arrived in late September or early October, depending on where you lived. For the tribes of the northern plains, the Lakota, the Blackfoot, the Cree, this moment was sacred. It whispered of the great change coming, the shift from abundance to endurance, from gathering to preserving, from movement to stillness. Picture this, a clear morning, the sun just beginning to paint the horizon in shades of soft pink and gold. You step outside your dwelling and the world has transformed overnight. Every blade of grass wears a delicate coat of white crystals. Your breath becomes visible, a small cloud that dances in the cold air. The silence is different now, heavier, more intentional. This is the frost speaking. And you know, there's something almost comforting about that first frost, isn't there? Even today, even in our modern world, that first cold morning of the season carries a certain magic. It makes you want to wrap your hands around something warm. Speaking of warmth, let me tell you about one of my favorite historical comfort foods. The tribes of the Great Lakes region, particularly the Ojibwe people, made something called maple sugar candy by boiling maple sap collected in early spring and stored carefully through the seasons. By the time the first frost arrived, they would sometimes melt down small portions of this precious sweetness and mix it with ground nuts and berries to create energy-rich treats. This practice dates back at least to the 1400s, long before European contact. Imagine the taste, pure maple sweetness, the earthiness of hickory nuts, the slight tartness of dried blueberries. It wasn't just delicious, It was survival packed into something that brought joy. But winter preparation wasn't just about sweet things. The Iroquois Confederacy, which thrived in what we now call upstate New York, perfected the art of preserving corn. They developed a process around the year 1200 that involved soaking corn in wood ash lye to remove the hulls, creating what we now call hominy. This transformed corn from a good food into a perfect food, easier to digest, more nutritious, and capable of lasting through the longest winter. They would dry this hominy and store it in sealed bark containers, sometimes buried in cool underground pits. When winter arrived, they'd cook it slowly with dried venison or fish, creating a savory stew that could feed families for days. Now, here's something that might surprise you. The tribes of the Pacific Northwest, particularly the Tlingit people, preserved salmon eggs, what we call caviar today, as a winter delicacy. They would dry the eggs carefully on cedar planks, sometimes smoking them lightly. This practice has been documented as far back as the 9th century through archaeological evidence. These preserved eggs were rich in omega-3 fatty acids and proteins, essential for maintaining health during the dark winter months. They weren't just a luxury, they were medicine, energy, and community celebration all in one tiny, unusual package. The preparation for winter was a symphony of activity that began the moment spring arrived. But it intensified with that first frost. Women would check the status of every preserved food, the dried berries, the pemmican, the smoked fish hanging in the rafters of food lodges. Men would ensure that every tool was sharp, every weapon ready, every shelter reinforced. Children learned by watching, by helping, by absorbing the quiet knowledge that winter was not a disaster waiting to happen, but a predictable challenge that could be met with preparation and community. The Mandan people, who lived in permanent earth lodge villages along the Missouri River in what we now call North Dakota, created underground storage caches that were architectural marvels. These bell-shaped pits, dug deep into the earth and lined with willow branches and grass, maintained a constant cool temperature. Archaeological excavations in the 1950s revealed caches that could hold up to 60 bushels of corn, squash, and beans. The first frost was the signal to seal these caches, to complete the transfer of summer's abundance into winter's security. There's something deeply calming about this level of preparation, isn't it? In our modern world, we've lost some of this connection to seasons, to cycles, to the gentle rhythm of preparation and rest. But perhaps, as you lie here tonight, you can imagine what it felt like to know that your community had worked together, that every member had contributed, that when the snow came, you would be ready. Not because you feared winter, but because you respected it. The first frost also signaled changes in dwelling spaces. The Lakota would add extra layers of buffalo hide to their teepees, carefully arranged to create air pockets for insulation. The overlap patterns weren't random. They'd been perfected over centuries to allow smoke to escape while keeping wind and snow out. By the 1600s, when European observers first documented these techniques, they were amazed at how warm the interiors remained even when temperatures outside dropped to dangerous levels. In the longhouses of the Haudenosaunee, families would rearrange sleeping platforms, moving them closer to the central fires. They'd hang additional woven mats along the walls, creating layers of still air that acted as insulation. Grandmothers would check every corner for drafts, and any gaps would be sealed with a mixture of clay and dried grass. This wasn't frantic preparation. It was methodical, almost meditative work that everyone understood and valued. As the days shortened and the frost spread across the land each morning, ceremonies were held. The Anishinaabe people performed what they called the Feast of the Dead in late autumn, honoring ancestors and asking for their guidance through the coming cold. This wasn't morbid or fearful. It was a gentle acknowledgement that life moved in cycles, that their ancestors had survived countless winters, and that their wisdom lived on in the preparations being made. Children would gather the last of the autumn berries, their fingers stained purple and red, their baskets slowly filling. These late berries were considered especially precious because they'd survived the first frosts, concentrating their sugars and flavors. They'd be dried near fires, then stored in special pouches made from deer bladders, which kept them dry and protected from mice and insects. And as the sun sets on this first chapter of our story, as you feel your own body relaxing deeper into rest, imagine that first frost sparkling in the moonlight. Imagine a community at peace, knowing they'd done the work, made the preparations, honored the season. The harsh winter was coming, yes, but it held no terror for people who understood its rhythms, who had learned from generations of ancestors, who worked together as one. Let your breathing slow even further now. Feel the weight of your eyelids, and allow your mind to drift gently toward the next part of our story, where winter arrives in earnest, and we discover the true depth of Native American winter wisdom. The snow always came, not if, but when, and when it did, it transformed the world into something both beautiful and demanding, a landscape that required a different kind of seeing, a different kind of knowing. For the tribes of the Northern Territories, the first significant snowfall was often welcomed, not dreaded. It brought a certain peace, a quieting of the world, and it made certain kinds of survival work easier, not harder. Let me share with you how they lived within the snow, not against it. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic regions, and yes, I know we're talking about a vast area with many distinct nations including the Yupik, the Inupiat, and many others, had dozens of words for different types of snow. This wasn't just poetic or linguistic curiosity. It was survival knowledge encoded in language. There was snow that was perfect for building, snow that signaled incoming storms, snow that covered the best fishing spots, snow that animals preferred for bedding. When the first heavy snowfall arrived, usually in November, the Inuit would begin construction of what Europeans called igloos, though the Inuit word igloo simply means house. The construction of a snow house is something I find endlessly fascinating and surprisingly soothing to think about. Imagine cutting blocks of dense, wind-packed snow with a long knife made from bone or antler. Each block is carefully shaped, each one placed in a rising spiral that curves inward, creating a self-supporting dome. The process takes perhaps an hour or two for an experienced builder, but the result is a structure that can maintain an interior temperature of up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside air, even in the harshest conditions. This technique has been used for at least 4,000 years, according to archaeological and oral history evidence. But here's what I find truly beautiful about snow houses. they weren't just emergency shelters. They were carefully planned homes where families would live for months, where babies would be born, where stories would be told, where the long dark winter would pass in relative comfort. Small oil lamps made from seal blubber would provide both heat and light, their gentle flames creating a warm amber glow against the translucent snow walls. Sometimes, in the evening, you could see this glow from outside, the entire structure seeming to radiate warmth into the frozen darkness. Let's talk about winter food again, because there's something so comforting about the ways people created warmth and sustenance even in the coldest conditions. The Cree people of the northern forests made something called moose nose jelly that sounds unusual to modern ears but was actually quite delicious and incredibly nutritious. They would harvest the nose of a moose, clean it carefully, then boil it for hours until the cartilage broke down into a rich, protein-filled gelatin. This would be seasoned with wild herbs and allowed to cool and set. It could be stored in the cold and eaten as a nutrient-dense food throughout winter. This practice dates back at least to the 1500s based on oral histories recorded in the early 20th century. For something sweet, many Plains tribes made what could almost be called winter candy from the pounded pulp of chokecherries mixed with rendered fat and sometimes a bit of honey or maple sugar if they traded for it. The Cheyenne were particularly known for this treat, which they called something that translates roughly as cold-time cherry cakes. These small, dense cakes were perfect for winter because they wouldn't freeze solid like some foods, and they provided quick energy during long hunting expeditions. The combination of fruit sugars and fats was exactly what the body needed in extreme cold. But perhaps the most important winter food was pemmican, and if you're not familiar with it, let me paint you a picture of this remarkable survival food. Pemmican was made primarily by Plains tribes like the Blackfoot, Lakota, and Cree, though variations existed across many nations. It was created by drying lean meat, usually buffalo, deer, or elk, until it was completely desiccated, then pounding it into a fine powder. This powder was then mixed with rendered fat, often in a 1-to-1 ratio, and sometimes berries or herbs were added. The result was something that could last for years without spoiling, that was incredibly calorie-dense, and that could be eaten as is or cooked into stews. The process of making pemmican was perfected over thousands of years, with evidence of similar preserved foods dating back to at least 2000 BC. When winter storms trapped families in their lodges for days, pemmican meant the difference between hunger and comfort. The snow brought other gifts too. Many tribes used snow for insulation, piling it against the lower portions of their winter lodges to create a barrier against wind. The Ojibwe would sometimes build special winter lodges that were partially underground, covered with layers of bark, then earth, then snow. These structures stayed remarkably warm even when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The science is simple. Snow is full of air pockets, and still air is one of nature's best insulators. But understanding this principle in the year 1300 or 1400, without thermometers or physics textbooks, required deep observation and generational learning. Winter was also the season of stories. When darkness fell early and rose late, when the world outside was wrapped in white silence, families and communities would gather close to fires and share the stories that held their history, their values, their very identity. Elders would speak of ancestors who'd survived even harsher winters, of lessons learned, of mistakes that had taught entire generations. Children would listen, absorbing not just the content but the cadence, the pauses, the way certain words were emphasized. This oral tradition stretches back thousands of years, an unbroken chain of knowledge passed from voice to ear in the warm darkness of winter lodges. The Iroquois had a tradition that no important decisions would be made during the summer months when everyone was busy with planting, hunting, and gathering. Instead, the great councils would meet in winter, when time moved more slowly, when deliberation could happen without the pressure of immediate survival tasks. This practice, documented by European observers as early as the 1600s, shows a sophisticated understanding of time, rhythm, and decision-making. Winter wasn't empty time. It was thinking time, planning time, community time. Let me tell you something that might surprise you about winter hunting. For many tribes, winter was actually the preferred hunting season for certain animals. Deer and elk were easier to track in snow. Moose, in particular, struggled in deep snow while hunters on snowshoes moved relatively easily. The Athabascan peoples of the interior north perfected snowshoe designs over thousands of years, creating different styles for different types of terrain and snow conditions. Some were broad and flat for soft, deep snow, others narrow and long for hard-packed trails. The frames were made from birch or willow, the webbing from rawhide strips, and the craftsmanship was extraordinary. A good pair of snowshoes, properly maintained, could last for many years and make the difference between a successful winter hunt and starvation. Ice fishing, too, was a winter gift. The Inuit would use special knowledge of ice behavior to locate the breathing holes of seals. They'd wait, sometimes for hours, in perfect stillness in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. But they weren't unprepared. They wore clothing so perfectly designed for the environment that European Arctic explorers would eventually abandon their own gear and adopt Inuit designs. Multiple layers of caribou hide, worn with the fur both against the skin and facing outward, trapped warm air while allowing moisture to escape. This principle, moisture management, was perhaps the most crucial element of cold weather survival, and native peoples understood it completely. As snow continued to fall throughout the winter months, trails would be maintained between lodges and to important resources like water sources and food caches. These trails were community infrastructure, everyone's responsibility. In some communities, young people would be assigned trail maintenance as part of their contribution, learning the landscape intimately in the process, understanding where drifts would form, where ice would be treacherous, where the safest routes lay. And here's something beautiful that happened in the snow. Children played. Yes, survival was serious, but life was still life. Sleds made from buffalo ribs or bark would carry laughing children down snowy hills. Games would be played in the snow, some teaching hunting skills, others just for joy. The Inuit played a game similar to soccer on snow and ice that required extraordinary balance and coordination. Joy and survival weren't separate in these cultures. They were woven together, each supporting the other. As you lie here tonight, perhaps you can imagine the gentle sound of snow falling outside a warm lodge. Inside, a fire crackles softly. Someone is telling a story in a low, rhythmic voice. The smell of cooking meat and herbs fills the air. Children are drowsy, fighting sleep but losing the battle. The wind might howl outside, but inside there is warmth, there is safety, there is community. The harsh winter is here, yes, but it has not defeated anyone. It is simply the season, met with preparation, knowledge, and the quiet strength of people who understand their place in the world. Let your breathing deepen now. Feel your body growing heavier, more relaxed. And let's drift gently into the next part of our story, where we discover the spiritual and communal practices that sustained people through the darkest, coldest months. There's something profound about winter darkness, isn't there? In our modern world, we can flip a switch and banish it instantly, but there was a time when darkness was a presence, a companion, something to be lived with and understood rather than simply eliminated. For the native peoples of the northern latitudes, winter brought not just cold and snow, but darkness that stretched for months. In some regions, the sun would barely climb above the horizon even at midday. In others, night would last for weeks on end. And yet, rather than despair, these communities found ways to create light, both literal and spiritual, that sustained them through the longest nights. Let me take you inside a winter lodge of the Gwich'in people, who lived and still live in the interior of Alaska and northwestern Canada. It's the middle of winter, perhaps late December or January. Outside, the temperature has dropped to 50 below zero. The sun, if it appears at all, will do so for only a few hours, and more as a pale ghost than a source of warmth. But inside the lodge, there is light. Small oil lamps burn steadily, fueled by rendered fish oil or animal fat. These aren't just light sources. They're carefully maintained fires that have been kept alive for generations, literally. Some communities maintain ceremonial fires that were never allowed to go completely out, their embers carefully preserved and transferred when people moved from winter to summer camps. This practice has been documented among various Athabascan groups for at least 1,000 years. The light from these lamps is soft, golden, and warm. It dances on the faces of people gathered together. It makes shadows that children watch, finding stories in their movements. But there was another kind of light in the winter darkness, something that might seem surprising. Festivals, celebrations, ceremonies that marked the passage of time and maintained community spirit. The darkest part of winter, rather than being a time of depression or mere survival, was often a time of important spiritual and social activity. The Iroquois, for instance, held their midwinter ceremony, which typically lasted for several days in late January or early February. This wasn't a solemn, dreary affair. It included singing, dancing, games, feasting, and the renewal of sacred relationships. People would go from longhouse to longhouse, stirring the ashes of fires to symbolize renewal, offering thanks, and reinforcing community bonds. This tradition dates back centuries before European contact and continues in many communities today. The ceremony acknowledged that yes, winter was hard, yes, the darkness was long, but the community was strong, and spring would come again. It was a celebration of resilience, of continuity, of shared purpose. Let's talk about winter foods again, because during these celebrations and long dark nights, food wasn't just fuel, it was comfort, connection, and culture. The Haudenosaunee people made something called Three Sisters soup in winter using their carefully preserved corn, beans, and squash. These three crops, grown together in a mutually beneficial agricultural system developed over thousands of years, were considered sacred gifts. The soup would simmer for hours over a low fire, the ingredients softening and blending into something truly comforting. They might add dried wild onions, herbs, and if available, some smoked meat. The smell alone was healing, and sharing this soup reinforced the relationship between people, plants, and the earth itself. This agricultural system dates back to at least 1000 CE and represented one of the most sophisticated farming techniques in the pre-Columbian Americas. For something sweet in the darkness of winter, many eastern woodland tribes made a treat from hickory nuts. They would crack these incredibly hard-shelled nuts, a task often done during long winter evenings, and extract the rich, buttery meat inside. Sometimes these would be ground into a paste and mixed with a bit of maple sugar and formed into small cakes. Other times, they'd be added to corn cakes or simply eaten by the handful. Hickory nuts are extraordinarily nutritious, high in healthy fats that were essential for maintaining body heat in winter. Archaeological evidence from sites dating back 3,000 years shows hickory nut shells in large quantities, suggesting this was a winter staple for millennia. Now, here's an unusual one that you might find surprising. The Inuit and other Arctic peoples would sometimes eat the partially digested contents of a caribou's stomach, which sounds strange until you understand the nutritional science behind it. Caribou eat lichens and other plants that contain vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which breaks down quickly when exposed to heat or air. By consuming the predigested plant material from the animal's stomach, people could access these vital nutrients that were otherwise nearly impossible to obtain in the winter Arctic. This practice, called agutak, or sometimes Eskimo ice cream, when mixed with fat and berries, was documented by early 20th century anthropologists but had been practiced for thousands of years. It's a perfect example of how deep knowledge of nutrition and environment led to survival strategies that seem unusual to outsiders but are brilliantly adapted to specific conditions. The long darkness also necessitated ways of marking time. Without the clear daily rhythm of sunrise and sunset, other methods became important. The Cree and Ojibwe peoples used moon cycles, giving each full moon a name that reflected what was happening in that period. The January moon might be called Great Spirit Moon or Moon of the Severe Cold. February might be Sucker Moon, anticipating the spring fish runs that were still weeks away but were held in mind and heart. These names weren't just labels. They were reminders of where the community was in the great cycle, what had survived so far, what was still to come, and what awaited on the other side of winter. Stories became even more important during the long darkness. Certain stories were told only in winter, when the natural world was asleep and wouldn't be offended by tales of creation, transformation, and the activities of spiritual beings. Among many Algonquian peoples, winter was the proper time for sacred stories that explained how the world came to be, how humans learned to live in it, and what responsibilities came with that knowledge. These weren't entertainment in the modern sense. Though they were certainly engaging and often humorous, they were education, philosophy, spirituality, and history all woven together. An elder might begin a story as darkness fell and not finish until hours later, the audience held rapt by the telling, by the pauses, by the way the firelight illuminated the speaker's face. Winter was also a time for craft work that required patience and care. Women would work on intricate beadwork if they had traded for beads, or porcupine quill embroidery if they hadn't. These weren't just decorative arts, they were ways of recording history, of marking important events, of creating beauty in the darkness. Men would carve tools, repair weapons, and create ceremonial objects. Elders would teach young people these skills, hands guiding smaller hands, knowledge passing through touch and demonstration and quiet instruction. This work had a meditative quality, the repetitive motions, the focus required, the gradual emergence of something useful or beautiful from raw materials. The Tlingit people of the Pacific Northwest coast, who experienced winter darkness though not as extreme as the Arctic, created extraordinary button blankets during winter months. These ceremonial robes, made from wool blankets obtained through trade and decorated with elaborate designs in pearl buttons, could take an entire winter to complete. The designs represented clan crests, family histories, and spiritual connections. Working on such a blanket in the dim light of a winter lodge wasn't just craftwork, it was a form of meditation, of connection to ancestors, of preparation for the ceremonies that would mark spring's arrival. There's something deeply comforting about this way of living with darkness rather than fighting against it, isn't there? The acknowledgement that yes, this season is difficult, yes, it's dark, yes, it's cold, but here we are together, and we have work to do, and stories to tell, and food to share, and that is enough. More than enough, actually. It's everything. Communities also developed sophisticated ways of dealing with the psychological challenges of long winters. The Inuit practice of song duels, where disputes were resolved not through violence but through competitive singing, often happened during the dark winter months. Two people with a disagreement would compose satirical songs about each other and perform them before the community, who would then judge the winner based on creativity, humor, and wit. This served multiple functions. It resolved conflicts, it provided entertainment during dark days, and it reinforced community values without requiring formal legal systems. Anthropologists documented this practice in the early 1900s, but oral histories suggest it goes back many centuries. Physical activity was also important during the long darkness. Games of skill and strength would be played inside lodges. The Inuit had dozens of games that could be played in small spaces, string games that created intricate patterns and told stories, strength competitions, games of balance and endurance. The Dean people played a game called hand game, a form of gambling that involved hiding marked sticks and guessing their location, accompanied by drumming and singing. These activities kept people engaged, active, and connected during months when venturing outside was dangerous or impossible. And at the heart of it all, there was always the fire. The fire was life itself, heat, light, the center around which everything else organized. Tending the fire was a sacred responsibility. Children learned firecraft from their earliest years. How to select wood that would burn clean and hot, how to arrange it for different purposes, how to keep a fire going through the night with minimal tending, how to read smoke and flame for information about weather and wind. The fire was never just a thing. It was a living presence, almost a member of the community, requiring care and offering gifts in return. As you breathe slowly in and out, as you feel yourself drifting deeper into rest, imagine that you're sitting near one of these ancient fires. The flames dance hypnotically. Shadows play on the walls. Someone nearby is working on a piece of quill work, their fingers moving with practiced ease. Someone else is telling a story in a low voice. Outside, the darkness is complete, and the cold is severe. But here, there is warmth. Here there is light. Not the harsh electric light of the modern world, but the gentle, living light of fire and community and shared purpose. The harshest winter could bring darkness that lasted for months, but it could not extinguish the light that people carried within themselves, the light of knowledge, of connection, of stories and songs, and the simple, profound act of taking care of each other. Let your eyes close now, if they haven't already. Feel your body completely supported by your bed. And let's drift together into the next part of our story, where we explore how native peoples moved through the winter landscape with grace and skill that still amazes us today. Winter in many native territories didn't mean staying completely stationary for months on end. While some communities settled into winter villages and minimized travel, others continued to move, adapting their methods and routes to the snow and ice. The ability to move through the winter landscape, safely, efficiently, and with purpose, was one of the most remarkable aspects of native winter survival. Let's begin with snowshoes, because they represent something truly elegant, a technology so perfectly adapted to its purpose that it has barely changed in thousands of years. Snowshoes aren't a single invention, they're dozens of distinct designs, each crafted for specific snow conditions, terrain, and uses. The Athabascan peoples of the interior north developed elongated, narrow snowshoes with upturned toes that were perfect for moving through forests where maneuverability between trees was essential. These could be 6 feet long or more, distributing a person's weight over a large area so they could walk on top of soft snow that would otherwise swallow them to the waist. The frames were made from birch wood that had been steamed and bent into shape, a process that required perfect timing. Too little heat and the wood would crack, too much and it would lose its strength. The webbing was created from caribou or moose rawhide, cut in long continuous strips and woven in patterns that had been refined over thousands of years. These patterns weren't just functional, they were beautiful, geometric designs that identified the maker and their community. Carbon dating of ancient snowshoes found in bogs suggests this technology is at least 8,000 years old. The Huron and other tribes of the Great Lakes region favored broader, more rounded snowshoes that were better for open terrain and the wet, heavy snow that was common in their territory. These were sometimes called bear paw snowshoes because of their shape. They were more maneuverable than the long northern style, allowing quick turns and agility while still providing excellent flotation in deep snow. But snowshoes were only part of winter mobility. Sleds and toboggans were equally important, and the variations in design show deep understanding of physics, materials, and practical needs. The Inuit created sleds with runners made from bone or ivory that could be coated with ice to reduce friction. They would apply a thin layer of mud mixed with moss to the runners, smooth it carefully, then spray water from their mouths to create a glassy ice coating. This coating, renewed daily, allowed heavily loaded sleds to be pulled over snow and ice with remarkable efficiency. Teams of dogs, carefully bred and trained over thousands of years, would pull these sleds hundreds of miles across the Arctic landscape. The relationship between musher and dogs was complex and deep. These weren't just working animals. They were partners in survival. Archaeological evidence from sites in Siberia suggests dog sledding is at least 9,000 years old, with the technology spreading to North America across the Bering Land Bridge. The Dene peoples created toboggans, flat sleds without runners, from thin planks of birch or larch that were steamed and curved upward at the front. These could carry enormous loads over snow, distributing weight evenly and gliding smoothly. A single hunter could pull a toboggan loaded with several hundred pounds of meat and supplies using a tumpline, a strap across the forehead or chest that allowed the powerful muscles of the back and legs to do the work. This technique might seem odd to modern people accustomed to backpacks, but it's actually more efficient for sustained travel with heavy loads. The slight forward lean required by the tumpline allows the entire body to contribute to pulling, and the load remains stable and close to the traveler's center of gravity. Winter travel also required intimate knowledge of ice conditions. For communities living near rivers, lakes, or the ocean, ice was a highway in winter, but a dangerous one that demanded respect and understanding. The Cree and Ojibwe peoples living around the Great Lakes developed sophisticated knowledge of ice safety that was passed down through generations. They could read ice color and texture to determine its thickness and strength. Clear blue ice was strong. White opaque ice contained air bubbles and was less reliable. Ice near shorelines and around obstacles like rocks or vegetation was always suspect. They knew that ice spoke. It made sounds as temperatures changed, as currents moved beneath it, as pressure built up. Learning to interpret these sounds was part of every child's education. The Inuit navigated sea ice with even greater expertise, because their lives depended on it. They traveled across ice that was constantly moving, breaking apart, and refreezing. They could identify thin spots from a distance by the color and texture of the ice surface. They knew which cracks were new and which were old and stable. They understood how wind and currents affected ice formation and movement. This knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of close observation, allowed them to travel safely across landscapes that would be deadly to the unprepared. Now, let's talk about winter food in the context of travel, because you can't move through a frozen world without fuel for your body. Pemmican, which I mentioned earlier, was the ultimate travel food for winter. Lightweight, compact, incredibly energy-dense, and completely resistant to freezing, it could be carried in small pouches and eaten without preparation. A traveler could sustain themselves on pemmican alone for weeks or months if necessary. The Metis people of mixed native and European heritage became famous in the 18th and 19th centuries for producing pemmican in large quantities for the fur trade, but they were using technology and knowledge that native peoples had perfected thousands of years earlier. A single pound of pemmican could provide enough calories for a full day of hard travel in cold conditions. For something warm and comforting during winter travel, many tribes would prepare a kind of trail tea from various plants gathered in summer and carefully dried. The Ojibwe used Labrador tea, a plant that grows in northern bogs and has a mild, pleasant flavor and gentle stimulant properties. They would carry small pouches of the dried leaves and steep them in hot water whenever they made camp. This wasn't just a nice drink, it was a source of vitamin C and other nutrients, and the ritual of making and drinking tea provided a moment of warmth and rest during difficult journeys. Labrador tea has been identified in archaeological sites dating back at least 1,500 years, suggesting long traditional use. For quick energy during travel, many hunters carried small bags of maple sugar mixed with ground, dried corn. This mixture, when eaten by the handful, provided immediate energy from the sugar and sustained energy from the corn. The Iroquois called it traveling food and considered it essential for winter hunting expeditions. A small pouch of this mixture could keep a hunter going for days of hard travel through deep snow and extreme cold. Here's something unusual that you might find interesting. Some Arctic peoples would eat snow that had been mixed with seal oil and sometimes a bit of fermented meat. This mixture, which sounds unappetizing to modern ears, was actually quite practical. The oil provided concentrated calories and fat-soluble vitamins. The snow provided hydration without the need to build a fire and melt it, which saved crucial time and fuel in emergency situations. The slight fermentation of the meat added probiotics and made certain nutrients more bioavailable. This practice has been documented by anthropologists working with Inuit communities in the early 20th century, who noted that elders considered it an important survival skill passed down from ancestors. Winter travel required careful planning and the ability to read the landscape in ways that are almost lost to modern people. Travelers would note landmarks, unusual rocks, specific trees, the shape of hills, and remember them under completely different conditions. A landscape that looked one way in summer could be unrecognizable under 6 feet of snow, but experienced travelers could still navigate because they understood the underlying geography, the bones of the land beneath its white covering. The Dean people were famous for their ability to travel vast distances across the northern forests and tundra in winter. They would move between hunting grounds, visit other communities, and maintain trade networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. They traveled light and fast, living off the land and carrying supplies, moving through countries that European explorers found nearly impossible to cross. Their routes, established over thousands of years, followed natural corridors, avoided areas prone to avalanches or unsafe ice, and connected reliable water sources and camping spots. This knowledge was encoded in stories, songs, and direct teaching, creating mental maps of extraordinary detail and accuracy. Stars and natural phenomena also guided winter travelers. Many native peoples were accomplished astronomers, not in the modern scientific sense, but in the practical sense of using celestial bodies for navigation and timekeeping. The North Star, always reliable, could orient a traveler even when landmarks were obscured by snow or darkness. Certain constellations appeared in specific parts of the sky at specific times of winter, providing a celestial calendar. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, were not just beautiful but also informative. Inuit traditions held that they indicated weather changes and could guide travelers. Winter storms, of course, were the greatest danger to travelers. Blizzards could strike with terrifying speed, reducing visibility to zero and creating wind chills that could kill in minutes. Experienced travelers could read weather signs, the behavior of animals, the quality of light, the feel of the wind, the types of clouds, and predict storms with remarkable accuracy. When caught in a blizzard, they knew how to quickly build emergency shelters. The Inuit could construct a survival igloo in less than an hour, even in the midst of a storm. Forest-dwelling peoples knew how to dig into snowdrifts or build lean-tos against thick tree trunks, using evergreen branches for insulation. These weren't comfortable accommodations, but they were the difference between life and death. As you lie here, feeling your body completely relaxed, imagine traveling through a pristine winter landscape. The snow stretches endlessly in all directions, brilliant white under a pale blue sky. Your snowshoes make a soft, rhythmic sound with each step. Your breath comes out in clouds. The cold is sharp in your lungs but invigorating rather than painful because you're dressed properly, moving steadily, part of the landscape rather than fighting against it. You know where you're going. You know you'll get there. The winter is harsh, yes, but you have the knowledge, the tools, and the skill to move through it with confidence and grace. The ability to travel through winter wasn't just a survival skill, it was a form of freedom. It meant communities weren't isolated by snow and cold. It meant hunters could follow game across vast territories. It meant families could visit each other, trade could continue, and the web of relationships that held cultures together could be maintained even when the world was frozen. Let your breathing slow even more now. Feel yourself sinking deeper into your bed, into rest, into the gentle story unfolding around you. And as you drift, let's move into the next chapter, where we explore the spiritual dimensions of winter and how Native peoples found meaning, beauty, and connection even in the harshest conditions. Winter, for many Native peoples, was not merely a physical challenge to be endured but a spiritual season with its own significance, teachings, and sacred dimensions. The harshness of winter wasn't separate from its spiritual importance. In many ways, the severity of the season made its teachings more profound, its lessons more deeply felt. Let me take you into the spiritual world of winter, where cold and darkness weren't enemies but teachers, where survival and spirituality were inseparable, and where even the harshest conditions could reveal beauty, meaning, and connection to powers greater than the individual. Among the Lakota people, winter was associated with Wazia, the old man of the north, a powerful spirit who brought snow and cold. Wazia wasn't viewed as an evil figure but as a necessary force in the natural world, one who brought rest to the earth, tested the strength and preparation of people, and reminded everyone of their place in the greater cycles of existence. Stories told about Wazia weren't designed to frighten but to teach respect. Respect for winter's power, respect for the need to prepare, and respect for the spiritual dimensions of the natural world. These teachings have been part of Lakota tradition for at least 800 years based on oral histories and pictographic records. The Vision Quest, a profound spiritual practice among many Plains tribes, could be undertaken even in winter, though it was far more dangerous and therefore even more spiritually significant. A young person seeking guidance would go out into the wilderness alone, without food, without shelter, and spend days in prayer and meditation, seeking a vision that would guide their life path. Winter vision quests were rare and undertaken only by those with specific callings or exceptional spiritual need. The ordeal of sitting on a lonely hilltop in freezing temperatures, exposed to wind and snow, was seen as stripping away everything superficial, leaving only the essential self open to spiritual communication. Those who survived and received visions were considered to have been given particularly powerful medicine because they'd been tested so severely. Early anthropological records from the 1800s document this practice, though the traditions themselves are far older. The sweat lodge, used by many native peoples for purification and spiritual renewal, took on special significance in winter. The contrast between the freezing exterior world and the intense heat inside the lodge made the experience even more powerful. Participants would enter the dark, dome-shaped structure, and water would be poured over heated stones, creating billowing steam. In summer, this was purifying and cleansing. In winter, it was life-affirming, a celebration of warmth and the body's resilience. After the ceremony, participants would sometimes roll in the snow or plunge into icy water, the shock to the system considered spiritually and physically renewing. This practice has been documented among dozens of native nations and appears in archaeological records going back at least 1,500 years. Winter was also the season of dreaming, both literally and spiritually. The long nights and extended time spent indoors meant more sleep and therefore more dreams. Many native cultures placed profound importance on dreams as messages from the spiritual world, and winter dreams were considered especially significant. The Ojibwe practiced dream fasting even in winter, where individuals would isolate themselves, eat sparingly, and focus on their dreams, believing that the hardship of winter made the spiritual veil thinner and messages clearer. Dream interpretation was a skill taught by elders, and winter evenings would often include discussions of dreams and their meanings. This practice of taking dreams seriously as spiritual and psychological guidance has been documented in Anishinaabe culture for at least 400 years through written records, though oral traditions suggest far greater antiquity. Let's talk about food in a spiritual context, because in many native cultures, food was never merely sustenance. It was gift, relationship, and sacred responsibility. The first kill of winter, whether a deer, a moose, or a seal, was often accompanied by ceremonies of thanks. The Inuit would offer a drink of fresh water to a seal they had hunted, believing the animal's spirit was thirsty after its journey from the sea. This wasn't superstition. It was an expression of respect, an acknowledgement that the animal had given its life so that people might live. The meat from this first kill might be shared among the entire community, no matter who had made the kill, reinforcing that the gifts of winter belonged to everyone. This practice has been documented by anthropologists working in Arctic communities since the early 1900s, and oral traditions trace it back hundreds of years. The Haudenosaunee gave thanks for the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, even in the depths of winter, acknowledging that these gifts, grown in summer and preserved with care, were sustaining them through the cold. The Thanksgiving address, a long prayer of gratitude that acknowledged every element of creation, was recited regularly, including during winter. It thanked the earth, the waters, the plants, the animals, the birds, the four winds, the thunder, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the Creator. This wasn't rote recitation. It was mindful acknowledgement of interconnection and dependence. The address could take half an hour or more to complete, and every element was considered important. Anthropologists have documented versions of this address since the 1700s, but the practice is acknowledged to be far older. Here's a sweet element of winter spirituality. Many tribes made special ceremonial foods that were only prepared for spiritual occasions. The Cherokee made a drink from roasted hickory nuts ground into a paste and mixed with water, creating something like a nutty, sweet milk. This was served during winter ceremonies and considered both nourishing and spiritually significant. The preparation of this drink was accompanied by prayers and songs, transforming a simple food into a sacrament. This practice has been documented in Cherokee communities since at least the 1700s. For something savory and ceremonially important, the Ojibwe would prepare wild rice mixed with maple sugar and fish oil for winter feasts associated with spiritual gatherings. Wild rice, harvested in late summer from lakes and slow-moving streams, was considered a gift from the Creator, and its preparation and consumption were accompanied by specific protocols and prayers. The combination of wild rice, maple, and fish oil created a dish that was both delicious and deeply meaningful, connecting the people to the waters, the forests, the seasons, and the spiritual forces that sustain them. Archaeological evidence suggests wild rice has been harvested in the Great Lakes region for at least 3,000 years. Now for something unusual in the spiritual food category. Certain tribes would prepare specific foods for use in divination practices during winter. The Inuit would sometimes use the shoulder blade of a seal, cleaned and dried, as a tool for predicting weather, hunting success, and other important matters. The bone would be heated carefully, and the patterns of cracks that appeared were read by experienced elders. Before this divination, the community might share a meal that included specific parts of the seal prepared in traditional ways, creating a ceremonial context for the spiritual practice. This form of scapulomancy, divination by shoulder blade, has been documented across many northern cultures and appears in archaeological contexts going back thousands of years. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, held spiritual significance for many Arctic and subarctic peoples. The Inuit believed they were the spirits of ancestors, dancing and playing games in the sky. Children were taught to whistle at the lights, which would sometimes make them brighten and swirl more actively. This wasn't just charming folklore. It was a way of maintaining relationships with ancestors, of teaching children that death wasn't an ending but a transformation, and that those who had gone before were still present, still connected to the living. The long winter nights, when the aurora was most visible, became times of spiritual connection and remembrance. Early European explorers noted these beliefs in journals from the 1600s and 1700s, but the traditions themselves are far older. Winter ceremonies often involved elaborate preparations that took the entire community's participation. The Kwakwaka'wakw people of the Pacific Northwest held winter potlatch ceremonies that were the culmination of years of preparation. Though not facing the extreme cold of Arctic peoples, their winters were dark and wet, and the potlatch served similar functions. It reinforced social bonds, redistributed wealth, maintained cultural identity, and marked important transitions. Families would give away enormous quantities of goods, blankets, coppers, food, carved boxes, canoes, in ceremonies that could last for days. The generosity displayed at a potlatch was a measure of honor and spiritual power. The Canadian government actually banned potlatch ceremonies in the late 1800s, considering them economically wasteful, which shows how profoundly Europeans misunderstood the spiritual and social functions of these winter gatherings. The ban was lifted in 1951, and potlatch traditions have experienced a strong revival. Archaeological evidence suggests these ceremonies have been practiced for at least 1,500 years. The spiritual dimension of winter also included acceptance of death. Winter was when elders who had survived many seasons would sometimes choose to pass on. In some nomadic cultures, if an elder could no longer travel and would slow down the group's ability to reach winter hunting grounds, they might choose to stay behind, making their peace with the world and entering death consciously and deliberately. This practice, documented among some Inuit and subarctic groups by early anthropologists, is often misunderstood as abandonment or cruelty. But accounts from the people themselves describe it differently, as an act of courage and self-sacrifice, done to give younger generations a better chance of survival, and done with ceremony, respect, and honor. The elderly would be left with supplies, in a comfortable place, and their passing was mourned but also celebrated as a final act of love for their community. Silence was also a spiritual practice in winter. The natural world itself became quieter. Birds migrated, insects disappeared, even the wind sometimes stilled, leaving a silence that was profound and almost absolute. Many native spiritual traditions valued silence as a way of listening to the world, to spirits, to one's own inner voice. Winter, with its enforced stillness and quiet, became a season for this deep listening. Hunters would sit motionless for hours in the cold, not just waiting for game but practicing a form of meditation, becoming part of the winter landscape, experiencing themselves as one element in a vast, interconnected whole. This practice of meditative hunting has been documented across numerous native cultures and is often described by practitioners as spiritual work as much as physical survival. As you breathe slowly and deeply, as you feel yourself at the very edge of sleep, imagine sitting in perfect stillness in a winter landscape. The cold is there, but you're properly dressed and it doesn't threaten you. The silence is complete. No cars, no machines, no human noise at all. Just the occasional creak of ice settling or the soft whoosh of snow sliding from a branch. In this silence, in this stillness, there is a presence. Not threatening but vast. The presence of winter itself, perhaps. Or the presence of the sacred that permeates everything, more noticeable now that everything loud and distracting has been stripped away. You sit. You breathe. You are simply present. And somehow, in this harsh season, you feel more alive, more connected, more aware than ever before. The spiritual teachings of winter weren't separate from practical survival. They were integrated into every aspect of winter life. Preparation was spiritual practice. Sharing was spiritual practice. Storytelling was spiritual practice. The care of tools, the respect shown to animals, the attention paid to children's learning, all of it was woven together into a worldview where survival and spirituality weren't different categories but different aspects of the same sacred relationship with the world. Let your eyes remain closed now. Feel your body completely at rest. And let's drift into our final chapter, where we bring all these threads together and reflect on what the winter wisdom of native peoples can teach us, even today, even in our modern world of central heating and grocery stores and electric lights. We've journeyed together through the long winter, haven't we? We've seen the first frost and the preparations it demanded. We've experienced the snow falling and transforming the world. We've sat in the warm darkness of winter lodges, traveled across frozen landscapes, and touched the spiritual dimensions of the coldest season. Now, as we come to the end of our story, let's reflect on what all of this means, not just as history, not just as fascinating tales from the past, but as wisdom that still speaks to us today. The native peoples of North America faced winters that would kill unprepared people in days or even hours. Temperatures that dropped to 50 or 60 below zero. Darkness that lasted for months. Snow that buried entire landscapes. Storms that struck without warning. Isolation that could mean a single mistake had no remedy, no rescue, no second chance. And yet, they not only survived, they thrived. They created rich cultures, complex societies, profound spiritual traditions, and artistic achievements that still inspire us today. How did they do it? The answer, I think, lies in a way of seeing the world that we've largely lost in our modern lives. They didn't view winter as an enemy to be conquered or a problem to be solved with technology. They saw it as a teacher, a season with its own gifts, a part of the great cycle that gave life its meaning and rhythm. Consider preparation. We've talked about the elaborate preparations that began with the first frost. The preserving of food, the reinforcing of shelters, the making of winter clothing, the checking and rechecking of supplies. This wasn't done in panic or fear. It was done with methodical care, with generational knowledge, with the understanding that preparation was a form of respect. Respect for winter, respect for the natural world, respect for one's own life and the lives of family and community. In our modern world, we've outsourced most of this preparation. We trust that the grocery store will always be stocked, that the power company will keep our heat running, that the infrastructure we depend on will function regardless of season or weather. And most of the time it does. But when it doesn't, when a storm knocks out power for days, when supply chains break down, when systems fail, we remember, suddenly and sharply, how vulnerable we actually are. The native peoples we've been learning about didn't have that vulnerability because they didn't have that dependence. They were more resilient because their survival didn't depend on systems they couldn't control. Let's think about community. Throughout our story, we've seen that winter survival was never an individual achievement. It was always communal. The food was shared. The work was shared. The knowledge was shared. Children learned from their elders. Hunters provided for those who couldn't hunt. The strong helped the weak. And this wasn't charity in the sense we often think of it. It was simply how things were done, because everyone understood that their own survival depended on the community's survival. The potlatch ceremonies of the Pacific Northwest, where families would give away enormous quantities of goods, seem almost incomprehensible in our culture of accumulation and individual wealth. But in that context, generosity was power, and wealth existed to be circulated, not hoarded. The person who gave the most was honored the most, because they had strengthened the entire community. This creates a very different relationship between people, doesn't it? One where your security comes not from how much you have, but from how strong your relationships are, how much you've given, how deeply you're woven into the fabric of community. We've also explored food in depth throughout this story, and I hope you've noticed that food was never just fuel. Every meal we discussed, from the maple sugar candy of the Ojibwe to the fermented seal preparation of the Inuit, was embedded in culture, in knowledge, in relationship with the land and with history. People knew where their food came from because they had harvested, hunted, or gathered it themselves. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were sacred. They knew animal behavior, migration patterns, the ecology of their territory in intimate detail. Today, most of us are utterly disconnected from food sources. We know grocery stores and restaurants, but we don't know seasons, we don't know soil, we don't know the work that brings food to our plates. And in losing that connection, we've lost something important. Not just practical knowledge, but a way of being in relationship with the world that's more reciprocal, more respectful, more sustainable. Let me share one more food story with you, something sweet to close this thread. The Lenape people, who lived in what we now call the Mid-Atlantic region, would make special winter cakes from ground chestnuts, dried blueberries, and a bit of honey. These would be formed into small cakes and stored in cool places where they'd keep for months. When spring began to show its first signs, when the days got a tiny bit longer, when the quality of light changed, these cakes would be brought out and shared in ceremonies welcoming the returning sun. The cakes represented the stored sweetness of summer, carefully preserved and waiting through winter to be released when hope returned. This practice has been documented in Lenape oral histories passed down through generations, though the culture itself faced devastating disruption through colonization. But the memory persists, and some Lenape communities today are reviving these traditions, reconnecting with food ways that sustain their ancestors through countless winters. And something savory for balance. The Tlingit people perfected a technique for preserving salmon that involved coating the fish in a paste made from rotten salmon eggs, then smoking it slowly over alderwood fires. This sounds terrible to modern sensibilities, but the process created a product that was not only safe and long-lasting but also deeply flavorful and nutritious. The slight fermentation added vitamins and made proteins more digestible. This preserved salmon was a staple winter food, and preparing it was highly skilled work that took years to master. It required knowing exactly when salmon were at peak condition, understanding fire and smoke, judging fermentation by smell and texture, and timing everything perfectly. This knowledge dates back at least 2,000 years based on archaeological evidence from ancient village sites. For something unusual to close our food exploration, some eastern woodland tribes would preserve eggs by coating them in a thick layer of pine pitch, which created an airtight seal. These preserved eggs could last for months and provided a rare source of fresh protein in late winter when other supplies were running low. The eggs would be carefully unearthed from their pitch coating and cooked, still fresh and edible. This practice required knowing exactly which pine species produced the right kind of pitch, when to harvest it, and how to apply it without cooking the eggs with hot pitch. It's a small example of the depth of knowledge that existed about every element of the environment. The spiritual dimensions of winter that we explored in our last chapter also carry important lessons. The idea that hardship can be spiritually significant, that difficulty can teach and strengthen rather than just diminish, this is profound. We live in a culture that tries to eliminate all discomfort, to smooth every rough edge, to ensure that life is as easy and pleasant as possible at all times. But the native peoples we've been learning about understood that challenge had value, that hardship could be a teacher, and that some of life's most important insights come from experiences that push us beyond our comfortable limits. The vision quest in winter, sitting alone on a hilltop in freezing temperatures, waiting for spiritual guidance. This is the opposite of our cultural approach. We'd call it dangerous, irresponsible, even crazy. But for the person undertaking it, and for the community that supported them, it was deeply meaningful. It was a way of proving to themselves, to their community, to the spiritual powers they believed in, that they had the strength, courage, and discipline to face the hardest tests. And the visions received in such conditions were considered particularly powerful and true because they came at such cost. I'm not suggesting we should all go sit on frozen hilltops without food or shelter. But perhaps there's something to learn about the value of challenge, about not always taking the easy path, about sometimes choosing difficulty because it leads to growth, understanding, or transformation. The long darkness of winter also taught people to create their own light, not just literal fire and lamps, but the light of story, community, creativity, and spiritual connection. The intricate beadwork created by dim firelight, the stories told in the long darkness, the songs and ceremonies, these were ways of asserting that human spirit and creativity could shine even in the darkest conditions. We have electric lights now that banish darkness completely, but I wonder sometimes if we've lost something in the process. We've lost the depth of true darkness, yes, but we've also lost the appreciation for light, the value of creating beauty and meaning especially when, conditions are difficult. The mobility skills we explored, snowshoes, sleds, reading ice, navigating by stars, these represent deep knowledge of place and environment. Every technology we discussed was adapted to specific conditions, refined over generations, and passed down through careful teaching. There were no instruction manuals, no training videos. Just observation, practice, teaching, and learning from mistakes when mistakes weren't fatal. Today, we can GPS navigate anywhere, but we've lost the ability to read landscapes, to notice the subtle signs that indicate direction, weather, safety, or danger. We've gained convenience but lost connection and, arguably, a kind of intelligence that's based on intimate relationship with place. As winter drew towards spring, and it always did, no matter how harsh the winter had been, people would watch for signs. The angle of sunlight would change imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. Days would grow longer by a minute here, 2 minutes there. The quality of snow would change. Birds would begin to return, first the ravens and magpies, then later the waterfowl. Ice would begin to show stress patterns. And hearts would lift. The spring ceremonies that many tribes performed weren't just celebrations of survival, though they were certainly that. They were thankful for the lessons of winter, acknowledgement that the people had been tested and had prevailed, and preparation for the work of the new season. The stored food that had sustained them through winter would be running low now, and it was time to return to the work of gathering, planting, hunting, the work of creating the abundance that would sustain them through the next winter. There's a circularity to this that we've lost in our linear, forward, always forward culture. The year was a great wheel, turning through its seasons, each one necessary, each one teaching something important, each one preparing for the next. Winter wasn't a problem to be solved, but a season to be lived, with its own character, gifts, and lessons. So what does all this mean for us today? What wisdom can we draw from these stories of winters past, of people who faced conditions most of us will never experience? I think it means that resilience isn't just about having the right equipment or technology. It's about knowledge, community, preparation, and a way of seeing the world that accepts hardship as part of life rather than an aberration to be eliminated. It means that our modern convenience, while comfortable, comes with costs: loss of skills, loss of connection, loss of community interdependence, loss of direct relationship with the natural world that sustains us. It means that there's wisdom in traditional ways of life that we've dismissed as primitive or outdated, but which actually represent thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and adaptation. It means that some of the things our culture treats as optional: community, generosity, story, spiritual connection, relationship with nature, might actually be essential in ways we've forgotten. And it means that the human capacity for resilience, creativity, and grace under pressure is far greater than our comfortable modern lives usually require us to demonstrate. The native peoples of North America faced winters that, truly, tried to defeat them. Year after year, for thousands of years, winter came with all its harshness, testing every individual and every community. And year after year, for thousands of years, they prevailed. Not by conquering winter, not by bending it to their will, but by understanding it, preparing for it, living with it skillfully and respectfully. The winters didn't defeat them because they saw themselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it. Because they valued knowledge over possessions. Because they understood that survival was communal, not individual. Because they created beauty and meaning even in the darkest, coldest times. Because they passed their wisdom from generation to generation through story, demonstration, and patient teaching. Because they respected the power of winter while refusing to be terrorized by it. As you lie here now, at the very edge of sleep, I hope these stories have given you something. Perhaps a sense of connection to the people who came before us, perhaps some appreciation for the knowledge and skill that sustained human life for thousands of years, perhaps just a good story to carry into your dreams. The winter outside your window, if you're experiencing one, is mild compared to the winters we've been discussing tonight. But it's still winter. It still calls us to prepare, to gather close, to find warmth and light in community and creativity. It still invites us to slow down, to rest, to allow the quiet season to do its work for us. So rest now. Let your breathing slow to its deepest, most peaceful rhythm. Feel the warmth of your bed, the safety of your home. You are warm. You are safe. You are cared for. And somewhere in the long chain of humanity that brought you to this moment, there were people who survived impossible winters, who kept fires burning through long darkness, who preserved knowledge through thousands of seasons, who passed life forward so that you could be here tonight. If this gentle journey helped you unwind, if you found some peace in these stories, Feel free to let me know in the comments below. And if you drifted off to sleep somewhere in the middle, well, that means I did my job. That's exactly what these stories are for. Thank you for traveling through this winter story with me. Thank you for letting me share these pieces of history with you. Thank you for being here. Sweet dreams, my friends. May your sleep be peaceful, may your rest be deep, and may you wake refreshed, carrying perhaps a little of winter's wisdom into your day. Good night.